Before most of our times, they incorporated standing a lot more in worship. In fact, they would stand for entire worship services. They viewed it as lazy to worship God and sitting down, especially when taking of the Lord's Supper. And I'm not generally a fan of that until First Sunday Focus. Then I think it might be helpful for y'all to stand up. So, what's that? Yeah. Well, I'll try not to fall asleep in my own lesson. If you would be opening your Bibles to Psalm 131, we're just going to spend a couple of moments there together. We live in an amazing time. We have answers right at our fingertips. You don't even have to go to Google and search anymore. You can simply say, "Hey Siri," my phone probably will go off now that I said that. "Hey Siri," or "Hey Alexa," and you can ask them a question and then you'll have the answer instantaneously. And our ability to raise these questions and have them immediately answered, I think many times makes us believe that we are always entitled to the answer. That we always have a right to know, and that we should know it very quickly. But life, the longer you live, life presents you with real challenges that involve questions that you don't always have the answer to. And it takes humility to be able to live a happy and full and contented and peaceful life without those answers. Today, our word, as we continue our series through the one-word book, is humility. And again, I want to encourage you to follow along with those devotionals if you have the book. And if you haven't been keeping up, wouldn't take you very long to catch up with them. They're not too long, but I would encourage you to do that. But as we think about that word humility and the idea of our knowledge and the limitations of our knowledge and how we can live a contented life in the face of some great mysteries and maybe some confusing times in our lives, I want us to briefly look at Psalm 131. It's a very short psalm, and we'll make two quick points. It says, "O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore." The first thing that we learn from this psalm about humility from verse 1 is that humility admits the limits of the mind. It admits that. It admits there are certain limitations. The psalmist writer says, I'm not going to even try and contemplate things that are too high for me, that are too lofty for me, to things that are too incomprehensible. Now, pride, as we learned from the beginning of the Bible, is man's perennial problem. God often warned against it in Proverbs 6 and verse 17. A prideful look is something that He hates. And it's one of its great dangers that it leads us to do things that we wouldn't normally do. We see that from the very beginning in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6. It's often pride that causes us to meddle in affairs for which we are ill-equipped to get into. Have you ever known that person that feels like they always have to have an answer to every question you have? Or they always have to know something, and then they start talking, and you immediately know they don't know as much about the subject as they think they do, right? But they need you to know that they know, right? Or they start talking about subjects that they really have no knowledge of. But the person with humility understands and respects his limitations. We all have limitations when it comes to our knowledge. The Romans writer, Paul, wrote in Romans 12 and verse 3, "I say to everyone among you, do not think of himself more highly than he ought to think." Look at yourself, do an honest evaluation of your limitations, of your strengths, and of your weaknesses, and evaluate yourself correctly. Romans 12 and verse 16 says, "Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own opinion." I always find that language very interesting. Don't be wise in your own eyes is the way that the King James puts it. Don't be wise in your own sight. Don't ever get to a point in your life where you stand back and you're kind of looking at yourself and thinking, man, I am pretty smart, right? I've got this together, right? But there are certain examples of things which we don't know the full answers to, and if we thought about it for a few moments, we would immediately be humbled if we were honest with ourselves. For example, the reason for human suffering. We might know some things. We might be able to lay out a formula. Okay, this is why people suffer in this way. This is why people suffer in this way. And I think maybe some of that can be beneficial, but at the end of the day, there are still many why questions that remain unanswered. That was Job's problem. I'm a righteous man, a good man. Why am I suffering? What about prayer? Why are some requests granted? Why are others not? Especially when those requests seem so right. The abusive wife, the wife that's abused, asking for her husband to stop praying for it, praying to bring your wife or your family back. And those prayers go unanswered. Why? I learned very early, it doesn't help you to be very prideful as a minister, because people come to your office asking those questions. And the only answer I have is, I don't know. World affairs, why are certain world leaders allowed to be world leaders? Why the dictators? Why the tyrants? Why people like Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 4 and verse 25? I don't have all the answers to that, and I think maybe the best answer to that would be what Habakkuk came to in Habakkuk 3 and verse 17. He's looking at all the evil and all the difficulties in his world, and he says in verse 17, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the field yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stall. He said, if everything that could go wrong would go wrong, if everything was wrong in this life, verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The humble person is the individual who is okay with leaving in God's hands what belongs there. He's okay, and the humble person is the one who can live well without every question being answered, who is content with what has been revealed. To understand, as Jesus said in Matthew 6 and verse 34, that sufficient for the day is its own trouble. There's so much for us to do, fulfilling God's obligations, that when it comes to what He has revealed, that there should be little time to tie ourselves in knots over what hasn't. So the humble person, humility admits the limits of the mind. And then second, humility calms the soul. If you look again at Psalm 131 and verse 2, he talks about, I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. That word calmed means to make level, to smooth out, to bring into uniform state. So the psalmist is saying he has smoothed out the roughness of his emotional state brought on by his previous pride. The word quieted means to be silent, to have a quiet resignation. That is, he has sorted these things out within his soul, the seat of his emotions. His emotions are at rest. He's not anxious anymore. Now, here's the question. How long did it take David to get to that point? To where he says, I'm calmed and I'm quieted. How long did it take him to get there? I don't know. I imagine it didn't happen overnight. Charles Spurgeon once wrote, sooner may a man calm the sea or rule the wind or tame a tiger than quiet himself. We are clamorous, uneasy, petulant, and nothing but grace can make us quiet under afflictions, irritations, and disappointments. He likens his state now at the end of the psalm, the second verse here, to a child that's been weaned, a weaned child. Now, for any of our mothers who have weaned a child before, it's not always a very easy process, hard process for the mom and for the child. The child has to learn to do something that his body says is his right to have. He doesn't know why all of a sudden what was normal and comfortable and good and pleasant for him is suddenly being cut off. And it's not just about the food element that comes with it. As nursing mothers would tell you, there's a connection that they make with the child. And it's very comforting for the child. And all of a sudden, into this comforting world of his, there is a great disruption. And he doesn't know why. He doesn't know what's going on. But when the child is finally weaned, the child holds no grudge. At least I've never known one to hold a grudge for being weaned. And he still finds comfort in the arms of the same mother who previously denied his tearful cries. And the psalmist said, this is how it is for me now. I had some things cut off. There was a disruption in my life, but I've learned to be content. Why is it that the mother denied? Why do mothers deny their child this? Why do they stop the nursing? Well, because it was necessary for the child to mature. The child's not going to mature as long as he is nursing. Not in the way that he should. But the child, again, doesn't understand that. And the truth is that in the same way David tells us by using this imagery that God may deny us what we think we need. What we think we have a right to. And what we don't understand when this disruption comes into our life. But humility allows us to be comforted in the same arms of the same God who doesn't give in to our misplaced, though heartfelt tears. David closes with these closing remarks in verse 3. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. Hope or wait for the Lord. Leave in God's hands what belonged there. Trust Him. Yes, God created us with an intellect and with curiosity, and we need to use that in the love of God. But it is pride and a lack of humility that leads us to act as though there are no limits to those blessings, that we deserve an answer to every single difficulty in life. And if you're carrying that burden with you this morning, then you have to cast all of your cares upon Him, for He cares for you. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7. To humbly trust and wait on the Lord, who will bring full and ultimate salvation. Maybe that's you this afternoon. You need to humble yourself before the Lord so that He can lift you up. Whatever your need is, why don't you come as together we stand and sing.